There we go. There's always some technical difficulty as we go, but welcome everyone. This is our second in our series of Talk with Tom town halls, and I'm so pleased to see so many people joining us tonight. And we'll also be recording this and posting clips onto the website afterwards. But we're very fortunate tonight to have with us Grace Rivera-Oven, as well as retired officer Joe Lowery. And I'm going to give them a quick introduction to Grace and then to Joe. But before we get into that, I'd like to recognize we've got with us tonight Karen Bushel, who is the clerk of court, who is running for re-election. Thanks for joining us, Karen. Marco Rivera-Oven, member of our Democratic Central Committee. Marco, thanks for joining us. I saw Robert Bass, who is a candidate for sheriff, who's tuning in with us tonight. And I'm sure there'll be other folks who join in, and we'll make sure we recognize them as they join the conversation. But tonight, we're going to talk about community prosecution and what that means. And a lot of what it means is talking about partners. So I'd like to introduce some invaluable partners here in Montgomery County. And first, Grace Rivera-Oven. If you know anything about Montgomery County, you know about Grace and you know about her engagement and involvement in the Up County. I'm not going to say she single-handedly created the hub Up County, because she had lots of hands helping her, but she single-handedly willed it into being. I will certainly say that. She has worked tirelessly with marginalized members of our community to distribute food, produce, diapers, cleaning supplies, everything essential, including during the pandemic, distributing vaccines, connecting people with eye care, with health care. She's partnered with multiple organizations up county to bring those resources to people in need. She's a partner at a public relations and strategic communications firm. She's got broad experience working with multicultural groups in our community, including advocacy groups and human rights and on equity issues, both the county and the state level. She is on the board at the Strathmore Performing Arts Center in Casa de Maryland, as well as a graduate of Leadership Montgomery. She has a degree from Hood College in a bachelor's of law in law and society from Hood College. And I'm going to guess she has probably touched more lives in Montgomery County alone than many people have. So it's very nice to have you here, Grace. And thanks for joining us. And so tell us a little more about you and kind of what drives you and your interest in the community and kind of this concept of community prosecution and how you think that might work.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. And hello, George. It's been a while since I've seen you since your retirement. So I'm delighted to be here. I guess my drive is just a sense that we are part of a community and that we depend on each other. And that became more evident than ever during the pandemic. The pandemic truly brought us to our knees in a sense, in many ways. And specifically in the brown and Black communities, we were hit very hard, disproportionately by this virus. And there was just so much pain and devastation and death at the beginning of it that my drive comes from making sure that there is access in a way that is with an equity lens, that every Montgomery County resident has the given right to have access to the services without barriers. And that's what drives me every day. And I was able to do the Up County Hub on the shoulders of many folks, including some of them who are here tonight, specifically my son, Marco, who, like many young people, was laid off during the pandemic. And he came to my rescue, and Bill Duffield is our director of communications, and Black Rock Center for the Arts was just a champion with us, and without their support and unwavering love that they had for the community to let us in, Lynn Arndt, the director, was very thoughtful in her way of opening the doors of an art center of all places to be able to do food distribution and food insecurity. So talk about being creative and thinking out of the box.
Well, Grace, I have not yet met an obstacle that you can't knock down. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us tonight and finding solutions in maybe unusual places. We're also very fortunate tonight to have Officer Lowery, another, I'm going to say, legend in Montgomery County. Officer Lowery had a stunning 33 years with Montgomery County Police. He's worked in a variety of roles, temporary and long-term assignments, including Wheaton, Gaithersburg. He's been a drug recognition expert. He's been part of the special investigations team and part of the auto theft unit. He's been on details, including the sniper task force. But I think most notably, he was previously a school resource officer and somewhat of a legend as a school resource officer. And what that program meant to a lot of people. He's, I think, been a passionate advocate for student safety and was most recently a school resource officer at Quince Orchard High School. And even though we've got a debate going on about SROs or CEOs or CEOs 2.0, I think everyone, and I think myself included, we're about making sure our kids are safe in every way, physically safe, they're safe and they feel secure where they are. So Officer Lowery, I mean, you came up certainly in Montgomery County Police. Tell us a little bit about a little more about your background and kind of your interest in community-based prosecution and what you think that might look like going forward.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and so wonderful to be with Grace. I saw Grace not this past holiday season, but the one before, the big toy drive they had up in Germantown at Black Rock, and I looked at her. I hadn't seen her in a while. I said, "You used to work at the state's attorney's office." So it was awesome seeing all the good things that she's done, and really appreciate all the work that she's done. My story is I'm a bit like a lot of people who live here. I'm a bit of a migrant here. I originally grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which in the late 60s and early 70s. And in '83, I moved here to go to college. I went to Howard University. And I remember when I first came into Montgomery County in '83, it was like something from a movie, because it was this diverse place with all these different restaurants in Silver Spring and all kinds of other cool things that were going on. And then I lived with my uncle just across the line for my first year of college. And then I ended up moving over to Rosemary Village, which is right next to Summit Hill. So I lived there for several years. And then I had a very interesting coincidental meeting of a bunch of African-American officers here in Montgomery County. And I will go back and say that, growing up in Detroit, it was not a great place to be an African-American young man in the city of Detroit. We had a lot of crime and a lot of violence happening. And unfortunately, the police did not have a good reputation with those of us of color. So when I came here, I was sort of still carrying that mindset. But I started having these really random occurrences with officers here in Montgomery County, but especially ones who were African-American. I had my motor scooter stolen when I worked at Errol's Video part-time off East West Highway. For those of you who've been alive long enough to know what Errol's Video is. And an officer that came to my house was Officer Marquita Anderson. And then I happened to witness an accident on the way home from school in my little moped I used to drive to and from college down to Silver Spring. And it was Officer Norman Brissett and Officer Buzz Fairby, who passed away, unfortunately. They were investigating that accident. I got to go to court as a witness. And so I started to have this bizarre sort of thing where I had all these officers of color who I just kept bumping into. I happened to be at a barbecue. I worked at the NIH for a long time as a research assistant. And one of the doctors who hosted me as a poor college student had a friend who was a guy by the name of Tony Emanuel, who was a young officer at the time. He was an African-American officer, worked at Bethesda. He actually asked me to go on a ride along with him. So So it was really amazing for me to have that experience coming from Detroit, which was not the same experience. And then ultimately joining the police department in the late 80s, and then coming up through the ranks, and then getting introduced to this community and how wonderful it is. I started my career in patrol like most officers, and I ultimately ended up being asked by, I was in the 4th district, which is the Wheaton district. And I remember myself and then Officer Yamada, who's now Chief Yamada, were asked by our captain to go meet some Esau kids. And this was probably 1989, 1990. And I know what Esau was, right? And so Mark and I went down to the high school, not really sure what we were going to be doing there or what we were going to be asked to do. And we just had this amazing interaction with these young kids. Back then, the Esau program was very small compared to it is now. And then so we had such a great interaction that we asked to go back again and again until our assignments put us in positions where we weren't really going to be allowed to be doing a lot of community outreach. So I did a lot of different assignments, and then ultimately, as Tom mentioned, but ultimately I came to my favorite assignment, which is being an SRO. Back in the day, we originally called us EFOs, Educational Facility Officers. I did that for about 4 years, and then the program went dark for a while because of budget cuts, and then I went back to the plain clothes world. And then in 2000, I guess it was around 2013, I came back into the program when it renamed it School Resource Officer, and where I was assigned to Quince Orchard High School. And then from there, that was really where we sort of got into the weeds about what does it mean to be an officer based in the schools and responsibilities. So I did a lot of work making sure that the new version of the program, because we were from EFOs, the SROs, was going to be better than the EFO program because it was going to be much more focused on outreach and less on any sort of arrest and that sort of thing. So we made a lot of good strides in those years, especially leading up to the pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And so that threw all kind of curveballs because, people weren't interacting with each other. And if you understand anything about good community policing, is you have to have interaction with each other. And so a lot of us started doing food drives and toy drives and things like that. I did a lot of that work. And then we had the George Floyd situation happen. And then we led into the discussion where we are today as far as officers in school. So I would hope that we would go back to more in-person engagement, so that we would do less virtual stuff and more in person. But I know that there's a place at the table for both. So I don't want to take up too much time, but that's kind of my vision at the beginning of this discussion.
Well, and that's a great lead into really opening up the discussion. And so for those of you who tuned in early and saw some of our scroll going across the screen, you'll know that there are 6 police districts in Montgomery County. And kind of for tonight's discussion, I'd like to focus on the district that encompasses Germantown and really talk about, community-based prosecution and what does that mean? You get that question, people are like, well, what is that all about? And it really is about engaging, it's about breaking down those barriers to communication that Grace was talking about. And it's talking about building those relationships like Joe was talking about. There was recently a murder of a young man, a stabbing, and I was on a community call in Germantown, and the conversation focused on people weren't willing to come forward in the community. And I know you've both been very engaged in the community, and from both a prosecution standpoint, but also a problem-solving standpoint. What are some of the barriers, Grace, that you see to us to breaking those barriers down to communication and building better community? And then Joe, after Grace, if we're looking just at Germantown, because it's a big county, and one of the things is we want to break it down into smaller communities so we can build those relationships. But Grace, what do you see as some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that we have there?
There we go. Okay. Yes, unfortunately, that's a very devastating case for the whole community. In fact, we were on the same call, Tom, when we heard the mom describe how horrific the death of her child was, her only son. She has a daughter, but this was her only son. And we really had no idea some of the details that this case involved and how violent the death of the senior from Northwest High School was. So to hear the police mention that the community knows more than what they're sharing, I guess what they meant is mainly the youth, the young people in that community know more than what they're sharing. And as a parent, I cannot imagine or even wrap myself around the fact that something like this could happen to your child. And then there's people out there who probably know who did it, who have vital information to solving a crime of this magnitude, and they're not feeling comfortable coming forward. It's just really hard to comprehend. And I think, you know, some of the barriers are that, especially with the pandemic, right? We have been isolated for the last 2.5 years as a community. We have been on survival mode in a sense with this virus. But even prior to that, the relationship between the police, and I will add, and I see prosecution as part of public safety involvement as well, was not really that robust. You know, unfortunately, years ago, we got rid of, for many years, we got rid of the community policing department because of budget cuts. And when I tell you that I begged not to happen, because it had taken so long to be able to develop a trustworthy relationship with the community, especially in the Black and Brown communities. You know, it's not something that just happens overnight. It takes a long time to be able to develop trust. And when that was taken away, I just knew that to get that back was going to be challenging. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now, the challenges of that. Even though we have the division back, we lost so many years of that development of, you know, we lost a generation really of folks who could be, you know, who could have been involved with the community. And unfortunately, now we're seeing that it's not just with this case, but we're seeing with other cases as well. You know, we had a young man who, by the grace of God, there was a police officer driving by when he heard the shots, and, you know, he knows exactly who shot him, according to the police, but refuses to say so. And we see this, you know, on and on. And it's really hard as a community member to be able to comprehend. So we truly need kind of hands on deck when it comes to public safety right now, but mainly involving the community as part of the solution, and building that trust again is so vital and important, and it's doable because we did it once before and we can do it again.
Yeah, I echo exactly what Grace was saying. I remember before they took the EFOs away in 2010, the year before, in 2009, that's when the community reached, I forget what their exact name, but they're basically, like you said, Grace, they were a group of dedicated officers. All they did was to engage. They did POW, Police Athletic League. They were I live very close to Good Hope, the rec center and that area. And there are kids who are now adults to this day who ask me about officers who see me, people like Wayne Farrow and George Stevens, who, by the way, is going to be retiring here in a few days. Yes. And so it was always, I think, a vision of the department as we were coming back, as the economy came back when they put the officers back in, was to also reboot the community engagement. They called it different things, but that's what it's called now. And it's ironic, actually, now I think about it, the first person who rebooted that was Mark Yamada. So he was, he made captain, he was that. So I think for me personally, I think the other thing that we don't often talk about is because we are dealing with limited resources and limited opportunities to re-engage with kids, that I'm hoping that we can get past being isolated so much. Because I think that, you know, the virtual thing is good for purposes of what we're doing today, but it really doesn't help. You really need that person-to-person contact to really connect with a kid, because you can talk to a kid all you want, but a kid needs to be able to be in your space and you'll look you in the eye and know that you're being honest and straight with them when you say that you're going to be confidential or you're going to help them through something and not just give a false promise. The other thing is, and I don't want to make this political, but you have to mention it. There's a lot of energy being expelled over on the county council side and the county executive side against the police. And even when officers do magnificent things, we hear very little information that supports and lifts up our officers. And so that's really had an effect because in effect, we have one government agency or entity, the county council and the county executive, and you have the police, and all of us are answering to the public, where there's a lot of energy being sort of wasted, in my opinion, where we really should have, like you said, Grace, everybody should be all hands on deck. Every trusted adult in this community needs to be out there trying to make connections with young people and make sure that that they have a voice and make sure that they need mental health issues. I know a lot of our violence is oftentimes tied to mental health issues, but I think that we've got to get back to working more together in a partnership.
Mhm.
And it sounds like, one of the things that I hear and that it sounds like both of you are saying is we've lost some trust, and trust is a two-way street. That's from the people who you entrust to do the job, as well as the community trusting the people to do the right job. And trust is easily broken. And I think we've seen that trust has been broken in some people, and we've got to work at restoring that. And we've got to do that in a person-to-person way. We've got to do it, in our schools. We've got to do it in our, communities. We've got to do it with our faith-based organizations. And so that's one of the groups I think we haven't touched on yet. I mean, both community and schools and policing, but our faith-based organizations. How did the two of you see the role for faith-based organizations in really community public safety?
Oh, to me, the role of faith community organizations are vital. Not just with public safety, but we also saw it with, during this pandemic, we saw it with access to healthcare, with vaccinations. I mean, one of the reasons why I believe, especially the minority health programs, Salud and Bienestar, which is with the Latino Health Initiative and the African American Health Program, were successful in doing so. It's because that direct partnership with the faith organizations, with the churches, and being able, to vaccinate as many people as possible on Sundays, on evenings, right? And them listening to their priest, to the reverend, to the rabbi, it's vital. And it's the same thing with public safety. Years ago, I remember going to this conference, and Eric Holder had just been appointed, and he talked about community prosecution, but he also talked about preventive community prosecution, which is something that you don't hear going hand in hand when you hear prosecution. It's like, well, we're not a social agency. We don't do prevention. We prosecute, and the police enforces. And I think we're at a crossroads as a community where you cannot just do that. That is not really working. But also we have to be very honest about the overrepresentation of Black and brown kids in the juvenile justice system in Montgomery County. If we're looking, at our micro community, and ask ourselves, why do we have that overrepresentation? And there's such a lack of understanding in the community of how the judicial system really works, right? The role of the police, the role of the prosecution, the role of probation, the role of the juvenile justice system, right? All these things that have an impact in the community, and how each division treats crime, same kind of crime that could be from somebody that comes, from a neighborhood in Chevy Chase versus somebody who comes from Longbridge or Deer Park, the exact same crime. And then we have to ask ourselves, why is this differential treatment when it comes to actually sentencing?
Right.
And that's why I really appreciate, Tom, you having me here tonight, because we cannot just tiptoe around these issues, right, without getting really to the essence of what is going on. We are a minority community, yes.
Yes.
So with that being said, are we really doing everything we can to be able to build the trust that we need to build with these communities? And yeah, and that is just so vital to this conversation.
Well, and I think you kind of hit the nail right on the head when you talk about oftentimes the prosecutors or sometimes the police really become the last stop on the social services ladder. And, I want my prosecutors to be out in the districts. I want them to be in the community, serving food, working at the hub, understanding the communities that we serve so that we can listen to the community leaders like yourselves. We can interact with our faith-based organizations and our police officers who are, at the schools or in the communities, and community leaders to say, well, here's the problem in our community and here's how we can solve it. And we're not going to incarcerate our way out of problems, but we are going to actually say, listen, is this someone who can be diverted, should be diverted? Connect them with better resources. I think Officer Lowery talked about, and I know Barbara Faustino mentioned in the chat, we pulled SROs out or we pulled police officers out, but we didn't replace them with other resources, mental health resources to actually address some of those core problems and look at other solutions other than incarceration or detention or arresting and going forward. So, I think that really is the heart of what I'm talking about when I talk about community-based prosecution is engagement and understanding and using those resources, as part of a bigger picture, a bigger web of social justice in our communities. And I before I kind of go on to the next topic, I want to recognize Michelle Whitaker, who's running for Central Committee, who's joined us, and also Captain Stacy Flynn, who is the captain for, I'm going to mess it up, community outreach, but I appreciate you joining the conversation tonight. And Officer Lowery, I know.
Can I just piggyback on what Grace was saying? I think we have to keep beating the dead horse. We really need to be all hands on deck. I think that one of the issues is that as the person wrote, that you took the officers out, you didn't even put the social workers there. But one of my primary goals, but not just me, but all the SRO's goals, was to really help find the kids sometimes who don't come to school, because a lot of those times those kids are needing services. And I didn't try to counsel that kid myself or whatever. I had a relationship with the kid, but ultimately I would connect that kid back with his counselor or with a pupil personnel worker or the school psychologist. We all have each other's phone numbers. We are always talking and engaging with each other. And I think that we have to kind of get back to that. The other thing too, I think I hear a lot about the disproportionate number of arrests and how we look at different people. But the one thing we don't talk about, and I think as an African-American male who grew up in the 60s and 70s, is that we have to also look at the disproportionate number of victims in our county that are brown and black, way higher percentage. If you look at the homicide rate, we literally doubled our homicides last year versus the year before. And if you look at the number of just say African-Americans, that was way higher than anything close to how our statistics are here. And we need to also look at what's causing that as well, because you can't deal with the arrests without understanding of what the victims and just looking at, for instance, I know in Silver Spring, and this has been going on since I was an officer in my early years, a lot of the criminal element would target immigrants, for instance, because they knew they were less likely to fight back and they were less likely to report. And so a lot of us, when we were working our magic in the communities, whether it be school-based or community-based, it was very important that we connected with those groups, like our immigrant community, so that they knew that the police experience they were going to have here was far different than where they came from. Because a lot of the criminal element relies on the fact that people are afraid to talk to the police. So you're right, it is a brown and black, but just like we're talking about the violence, and we'll get into that in a little while, but I really worry about a lot of our immigrant folks as well, because for every statistic that we have, there's a statistic we'll never understand. There's a lot of crime that happens in victimization where it never gets reported. And so we need to also keep that in the forefront of our minds.
That's a great point, Joe, and that's absolutely true. We have to reach out to communities who are underserved and underrepresented to protect them, not just to prosecute, but certainly that is one of those communities. And Grace looks like she wanted to add something in on that.
I just think it's we're very reactive in this county, and we're very little proactive. And back in the 80s and early 90s, when I worked under State Attorney Andy Sonner, he was very proactive. He was such a visionary. He was such a great mentor to me, but to many, many folks. I mean, we created pretty much drug court under him. He saw that these folks needed help. They did not need to end up in jail, but they needed addiction support. The domestic violence unit was created under him. The program that I have, which was an after-school program, which he got into a lot of trouble politically because, he was like, no, we do have an issue with gangs and we're going to deal with it. And we're not just going to prosecute young people who are coming out of horrendous situations, but we're going to do preventive work. Right. We're going to try to save them because they are young and they deserve a second chance. And that was literally what I named my program. And so I kind of feel we got away from that in the last 25, 30 years. And I feel like people just work in their silos. I don't see there's a lot of interaction and communication going on between public safety, health and human services, and Montgomery County Public Schools. That right. Like those channels of communications are just not connecting somehow. Everybody's in their own little island. And until we're able to actually create, two ways of communications among all these agencies for the better of our kids, it's going to be really, really hard to get things done.
Well, and you're right. I mean, we've got to get out there. We've got to get our hands dirty. We've got to pass out some frozen chickens. We've got to, help some people at the crossing guards and be engaged in the communities. But we've got to have hard conversations. As you said, the numbers don't lie about the communities that we're impacting. And how we go about that. We can't just sit back and let things happen and be reactionary. We've got to be proactive, and the best way to be proactive is to be out and engaged in that community. And now people ask sometimes, well, what's the difference between community policing versus community prosecution? And Joe, I'm going to ask you to tell us, just give us the 30-second view of the concept of community policing, and then I'll talk a little bit about community prosecution.
Yeah, the concept of community policing is very simple, which is it's basically the community, the police, the community individuals, groups in the police department, your state's attorney's office. It could be faith-based groups. It can be all sorts of things, but it's a positive sort of ongoing relationship where you're not just going to a community meeting every once in a while, but the folks that live in those communities are on a first name basis with their officer or officers in that group, and their officer supervisor and the captain of that district or whatever program it is. And I think that, again, not to blame everything on the virus, but that really affected us when Captain Flynn, and she can certainly probably do a better job than I can, but when she was sort of put into that space at the turn of this past fiscal year in July, there were a lot of things because we were going to be having a whole new division and going to fall under her and our new assistant chief, Faciolo. And that was going to include, for the first time ever, for the SROs to be under a centralized banner, which is how most programs operate here in the country as far as officers in the schools. And so it's been a little bit of a challenge because of the virus, because everything, and not even that, just when we all got back together at the event we had last week, and just like, it was so weird, like seeing a bunch of people who I didn't know in the same space as me. I mean, I hadn't seen that since a cruise I took a couple weeks back, and that was the first time. So we have to all kind of learn how to get back to a new normal. But I think that if the universe is willing to allow us to continue to engage. But I really worry about our youngest people, our folks that are in elementary school and even pre-K. A lot of those community officers, as you mentioned before, who worked in POW, worked a lot with elementary school kids. And so, and everyone knew everyone. The teachers knew the officers knew the principal, and at that age, at that group, and then the parents knew each other. And so we have to, it doesn't take, it's not complicated. And I know that someone mentioned silos, but there has to be some leadership that is behind making that happen, whether it be Andy Sonner 2.0 or someone else. But we have to make sure that we really are thinking about what's really the most important thing here. Is it really being on the news, passing another law or bill which would keep the police transparent as we're trying to do the best we can, or is it really, what can we do to make sure that we have opportunities for instance, like one of the things that I always thought was strange as an officer working in the schools, when I worked a temporary assignment at Wooten High School, when you have back to school night, and let's say it started at 7 o'clock, if you weren't parked on campus by 5:30, you weren't getting. And I remember leaving that instance and fast forwarding to my back to school night at Paint Branch High School, where my son went. And if I got there 5 minutes after 7, I could find a place to park. So those are a lot of big questions about engagement and making sure in communities and making sure that we all sort of look at what works in some areas and maybe say, what can we do to make things work better in those other areas? And the schools have to be part of that, because that's where, that's where our children go. That's where they learn how to socialize, and a lot of these issues that start in the community oftentimes coming into the schools, and some things that start in the schools come in the communities. So I like the vision of going forward. We have to really double down on re-engaging when no one's in trouble. Just, whether it be passing out frozen turkeys or ices or something. I don't know.
Well, I'll say I'm no, I don't know that I'm any Andy Sonner 2.0, because I think he was probably a one of a kind. But certainly community prosecution, I don't have a trademark on that. However, it is a revisioning how we do the work in that office. And they're recognizing that some crime is going to cut across the county. But a lot of the crime is based in the community that we're in. And a lot of the prevention we can do is in the neighborhood and the communities we live in. So, we're going to have 6 senior prosecutors who are going to be assigned to those 6 police districts. They're going to work with our police officers. They're going to work with our community leaders, like Grace, until she gets elected to the Board of Ed. But, we'll still work with her because she's invested in our community, and, we'll help problem solve. I did it before when I was in the Bethesda district, and we had aggressive panhandlers, and we worked with homeless shelters to make sure that the donations that people were giving were, turned into pass out cards so that people could actually give that to someone and know that their donation was making a difference. It was real problem solving. Not just locking somebody up, not putting handcuffs on, not incarcerating, but actual problem solving. And, we're not the same community we were 10 years ago. We're not the same community we were certainly 20 or 25 years ago. We are a majority minority county, and we've got to respond at that level. And, that's really what we're talking about, is engaging all of the resources we have, private, nonprofit, and government agencies to help address the problems in our individual communities.
And also, Tom, and also recognizing that not that every glove fits everybody the same. Okay. Something that might work in a community down county might not be the same program that's going to work up county or in Long Branch or in Germantown because of the makeup of the community.
Grace, that's a wonderful point. Tell me about how, give me an example of how a problem in the trailer park in Germantown, how we might go about solving a problem there that might not work, Officer Lowery, maybe say in Long Branch. How do we approach? I mean, those are different communities. How do we approach them?
Right. So somebody wrote about, so I'm a mediator by trainings, about the wonderful program that we have of mediation in Montgomery County. unfortunately, I think something like that would be very foreign to the folks at the trailer park, just because it's a large immigrant community. A lot of them have a lack of trust with law enforcement. I mean, this is one of the reasons, you know, they left a lot of their countries because of this. There's a lot of corruption with people in uniform back in their homes. So, you know, so I can just see, you know, well-meaning prosecutors saying, oh, we'll send this to mediation. And that would mean nothing to some of the folks at the trailer park, right? So having folks that also kind of look like the community that you're gonna be in, whether it's the Department of the Police, whether it's Health and Human Services, whether it's the Crisis Center, whether it's the Sheriff's Department, the Fire Department, or the State Attorney's Office. It is so vital in order to develop those relationships, because if you try to do it with an interpreter, you're not going to get the same results. Right. So hiring folks from the community, it's very, very important to community policing and to community prosecution. And for me, that would be step number one.
Right.
And I know that you have mentioned that you're very committed to doing that. And we also have such a young generation of folks in our community who are going, you know, they're going to social workers, psychologists, law school, teachers, right here in our backyard, and being able to also create those pathways to be able to, you know, to be able to foster and to be able to open those areas, whether it is, you know, for internships, which, you know, historically are done with people, you know, who have connections or from communities that don't look like me or that don't look like Joe, right? And
opening
being
those
able,
doors.
opening those doors, it is so vital to be able to get this right. So, you know, I think in the trailer park, our presence with the Up County Hub and bringing Officer Dixon and bringing Officer JJ Johnson, and these are two individuals who, even when they're not on duty, right, they feel the love for the community. And guess what? The community can tell when people are genuine about Ketty. You can tell, right? There's something about, you know, those radars that people have when they're very, you know, skeptical about some folks. So having folks like that, you know, they deliver food for us, right? We have an elderly person. She was very fragile. Her husband died from COVID, and having either Officer Johnson or Officer Dixon deliver the food to her every week, it meant the world to her. But then her neighbor, you know, mentioned something to her. So you're not afraid because he's in uniform? And she said, no. And, you know, if you see, you know, if you have an issue, you should let him know. And they do. There was an issue about, and, you know, in some communities, this might not be an issue, but in their community, their bikes were being stolen. And to them, that's a means of transportation. It's a low income, it's the lowest income community in Montgomery County. So there was a huge bike theft going on, and they got sick of it. And they were like, okay, we're gonna talk to Officer Dixon, Officer JJ, they gotta tell us what to do. And they did. And so it may mean, you know, it could be something minimal to some folks, but to them, this was their property. This is their neighborhood. They take pride in it, right? So to be able to connect with communities like that at a personal level, it is so important, you know, to have those, you know, community days, to have these prosecutors come out of their offices, you know, just to wonder, you know, I used to ask when I was at the States, I'd be like, do you even know what the trailer park is?
Right.
No idea.
Right.
Well, you need
we have
to.
a trailer park in Montgomery County?
Yes, exactly.
We don't have trailer parks in Montgomery
That's
County.
usually
right?
the question that I get, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm like, okay, if you are going to be doing this work of enforcement in any way, shape, or form, you owe it to the community to visit those areas and see and talk to people. It is just 101, communication level, if you will. So for me, that is such an important ingredient.
Officer Lowery, and we talked about stolen bikes, and that's an important thing in that particular community. Do you have another experience with maybe a different community who may be differently impacted with something that was very important to them, but maybe not the same way it was dealt with in the trailer park?
Well, again, I have a lot of experience in the community, but I go back to the school. So what we did at QO when I first started there, the school allowed me to have a community day with our ESOL kids. They were all ESOL 1 and 2s. And what we would do is we would pick usually PSAT day, because those kids don't take the PSATs. And so we would simultaneously partner with the schools. And what we would do is have a presentation, and we would talk about, and then what a lot of people don't understand in Montgomery County, we have over 20 different countries that our officers were immigrated from. One of my best friends, Eddie Rodriguez, is from the Dominican Republic. Eddie came here from the DR when he was 5, didn't speak English. Now he's one of our supervisors now. So he was an SRO. So I would bring Eddie in, and maybe one of the officer, Abagaber, he's from Egypt. Bring him in if we had some kids who were Arabic speaking. Officer Jimmy Chen, I brought him in if we had Chinese kids who were because Jimmy's from China. And we would have a half day. The school would allow us, we would talk about the experiences that kids had in their native language. And then it was amazing, because in the first 10 minutes, the kids were very quiet, because like you said, they were maybe uncomfortable with being seen police officers. But once they heard those officers speak their languages and understand that they came from the same places they came, it was 20 minutes later, and the kids are asking tons of questions and then sharing their experiences. And we would explain the difference between the police here, that local police are very different than officers who work in the federal level. We don't have anything to do with immigration. And so it would start a dialogue. We would feed the kids, we would have fun, and the kids would, it was amazing. And then afterwards, the kids were always coming up to me and if they had private questions they had. And so that started a great dialogue, and it allowed me access to the communities that served the school. If there was issues in the communities, the kids would come and tell me. And then maybe, QO is in a weird place, because a lot of the QO kids don't live in the police district, because like that was a goofy thing about SROs. I was a Rockville officer because QO was in Rockville, but most of the kids live in Gaithersburg district. So it was great, because I was very familiar with Clopper Road corridor in the area down by West Side Drive and that sort of thing. So imagine if we had that same scenario, but we had a community prosecutor come in for that day,
right,
and explain how prosecutions work. And oftentimes we have issues that every once in a while you have to get a protective order, and we would explain to kids what that is. So it was a great asset for the kids to have for us, but also for us to have the kids, because you can't keep communities safe if the community is not part of that tapestry, right, of keeping everybody safe. And you have to do that. But like Grace said, you have to actually get out of your cars, get out of your offices, and go engage people and be genuine. And then that's far more, like you said, the bicycle issue, for instance, it seems like maybe a minor thing to someone who rides their bicycle recreationally. But imagine if that's your main way to get around. And then imagine if you didn't feel comfortable going to the police and saying, hey, these kids are taking my bikes. And then the next thing you know, they're taking other things. And now we went from, small crimes to now bigger crimes. And then maybe there's a retaliation that happens. And that's when people feel like they have to join a gang and all these other things. So there's a lot of issues that we could handle if we just start small, but be very consistent.
You can't serve a community that you don't know.
Right.
And how do you know a community if you're not there in that community?
Exactly.
I think that's really what I want to bring. We've got a couple of questions, and we're getting close on our time. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time. This is a great conversation. I want to thank everybody for joining us. But one question, and I'll give you each just a little bit to answer. And this is from Lori Wilner. How can we find a meaningful way to partner with police and prosecutors, which historically has not been easy? Joe, I'll give you just a minute, Joe, and then Grace a minute, and then I'll chime in on it.
Maybe because I was such an old timer, but I knew most of the people. I knew all the juvenile prosecutors. I knew the folks. I even knew some public defenders. And I think this 2-year hiatus has really created a void because now I'm retired. I mean, I'm doing some other things in the community now, but I think that the main thing is just do it. Let's just start it. Let's start, this gather of all the partners, and let's talk about what's the best way and just start it. Because like you said, what works in Silver Spring probably might not work in Germantown. And so we need to have those conversations immediately. And if possible, in person. If you fire up a barbecue grill and you pick a nice, beautiful day, people will come.
Great. Grace, anything to chime in on that or add in?
Sure. No. So to me, community prosecution is really the non-dictation. You're not dictating a community how to solve a crime. You're actually engaging the community and telling you what are the best resources, of course, to go about doing that. And that, to me, giving people a voice in the process is vital, just absolutely vital, because it's part of the empowerment with communities that historically have not been empowered to be able to have a dialogue with law enforcement, right? So partnerships are so important. We have programs like the Street Outreach Network that Luis Cardona through the Department of Health and Human Services, right? So that's a Health and Human Services program. However, they have the pulse and they have such a direct contact with the community. They should be part of this conversation, right? And to me, that is just part of the empowerment that you're giving folks at the table. You're bringing, you're coming to their community, and you're pretty much saying, okay, so this is what we do. I remember back in the day, and I think Michelle Whitaker had a question about, do you think the communities would be wary about having prosecution? So back in the day when I was at the state's attorney's office, I used to, in the trailer park, we used to do a lot of the clinics of expungement clinics for the communities, because as you know that can really have an impact on getting a job, because of a mistake you made when you were 16, 17, or 18, and you just don't have the means, to be able to pay for all the court costs to get your background expunged, but things like that I think are really important to build that trust.
Well, and I think, Grace, I mean, I maybe you should run for office. Or wait, you are running for office, right?
Maybe.
And Michelle Whitaker has a great question. How do we, how might people view prosecutors to be suspicious of that engagement? And how do you create the trust that these programs can be, maybe they should be separate from law enforcement? I don't necessarily think they should be separate from law enforcement, because like Grace said, this should be listening, not dictating what the enforcement priorities are. You should be listening to that community, empowering them, and helping them solve problems. And then only as a last resort do you have to prosecute or incarcerate. But there are lots of other solutions, and we've got to be willing to embrace those other solutions in that community. And the community is going to help us decide what those priorities are and how they should be enforced. And that's a community effort. Well, I mean, I think we could all talk all night long, but I want to thank Grace Rivera-Oven for joining us, a community organizer and advocate extraordinaire, and a candidate for Board of Education. So please support Grace. You can hear her passion in her voice. Officer Joe Lowery for joining us as well. I mean, listen, if every police officer was a Joe Lowery, we wouldn't be having a lot of the discussions we're having today, because we'd have a lot of problems solved at the root, which is really what community-based prosecution is about. It's about truly engaging and empowering all of our communities. It's about problem solving at the community level and engaging in those priorities and listening to the community and helping us set those enforcement priorities. Not just waiting for the problems to come to the courthouse 90 days later and then playing cleanup on those issues. So I want to thank everyone, our electeds, as well as our candidates for joining us for this discussion this evening. And especially I want to thank Gracie, who's tuning in, not from here, and Joe for taking time. I think he's somebody who's in high demand tonight. So I just want to say thank you, everybody. And remember, July 19th is the primary. Get out and vote. If you want to make a change, get out and vote for change, because change can't wait. It can't wait in our communities, and it certainly can't wait in the state's attorney's office. As the chief law enforcement officer for the county, I want to listen to the community. I want to hear them, and I want them to help me set those priorities. So thank you all for joining us.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
Real quick, can we, I saw on your pre-slides that you had before, just once again, remind everybody that May 14th, there is a huge 100-year celebration, a community day at the fairgrounds. It's free of charge. So it's going to be amazing. It's going to be the police and the fire department are going to co-author, and we're going to be there with a lot of toys and a lot of demonstrations and food trucks and a lot of fun. So make sure people sign up and come out and enjoy each other's company at the beginning of a fresh start, hopefully.
Great. And we will push that information out as well, and have been. So, and there you go. It's in our chat. Click on it there right now, and be sure to join us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'll see you at the next town hall coming up, which will be on intimate partner violence and the importance of responding appropriately in those situations, and how we help address survivors of intimate partner violence. So thank you all, and especially thanks to Grace and Joe. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.